Hey there. Tonight we're not heading into grand castles or tracing the footsteps of kings. Instead, we're stepping into the forgotten corners of history, the places that never made it into paintings. We're talking about medieval peasants, the ones who didn't ride horses or wear crowns, who endured plagues, hunger, bitter cold, and 100 quiet humiliations, all without titles, without glory, without legacy, just long days, short nights, and a quiet enduring strength most of us wouldn't survive a single day with. If this kind of slow, calm journey through the past helps you unwind, feel free to like and subscribe, but only if it brings you real peace. And in the comments, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is. There's something strangely comforting about knowing who else is out there, falling asleep to the same quiet story. So now, dim the lights. Turn on a fan, if that soft hum helps. Settle in. And let's begin. At the edge of the map. This village has no name, or if it ever did, no one remembers it now. It rests in a shallow valley, nestled somewhere in the vague middle of nowhere, a soft crease in the land, just far enough off the path to avoid roads, records, or royal notice. You wouldn't find it on a map, even if you had one, which you don't. You've never even seen a map. Here the world ends where the trees begin. The forest is dense, slow-moving and old, like something ancient that only barely tolerates your presence. The fields stretch outward in irregular blotches of green and brown, worked to exhaustion, and then worked some more. To the north, there's a river, or so you've heard. You've never seen it, but it's spoken of in the same hushed tone one might use for dragons or saints. This is where you were born, and where you'll die, likely within 60 steps of each other. The homes here are rough and slumped, like they've been pushed too often by winter winds. The walls are made of wattle and daub, mud, straw and sticks, tightly woven and patched endlessly with whatever's left. The roofs are thatched and sag beneath their own weight, always leaking in places just out of reach. The village smells like wet wool, smoke and damp earth. This is the sour tang of livestock, the faint rot of something always decaying, but none of it surprises you. It's simply the smell of living here. There's a path leading in, but calling it a road would be generous. It's just a muddy trail carved by ox carts, worn into deep grooves that fill with rainwater and mosquitoes. No one important has traveled it in years, maybe ever. Most days pass quietly. Now and then, if the wind's right, you'll hear the faint bell of a chapel in a neighboring village. Otherwise, time is measured by the sun, the lengthening shadows across the field, or the dull ache in your spine that creeps in before noon. There are maybe a dozen families here, enough to fill a modest gathering on feast days. Everyone knows everyone. Everyone knows everyone's problems, and everyone politely pretends not to, until they absolutely must. The village elder, if you could call him that, is a man named Tom. He once spoke to a monk, and he repeats that conversation often as proof of his wisdom. No one questions it. His roof hasn't collapsed. His goat is healthy. That's enough leadership for most. Nothing here is exact. There are no written records, no deeds or surveys. Land is understood in terms like past the old elm or where the ground turns soft. Disputes are settled with a shrug, a short argument, and sometimes a loaf of bread passed between hands until no one feels like fighting anymore. There's no school, no tavern, no inn. If a stranger arrives, it's discussed for weeks. Where did they come from? What do they want? Are they cursed? Do they smell of salt? A newcomer is both mesmerizing and vaguely terrifying, and no one ever really leaves. Travel isn't something you plan, it's something you hear about, like a rumor. You've heard of towns, of cities, of places where stone buildings reach 2 or 3 stories high. But those are stories, no more real than talking animals or women who turn into birds. You can't miss a world you've never seen. The forest is thick. The hills are long. The roads, if they exist, are better known for bandits and misfortune than for leading anywhere worth reaching. And what would you do if you got there? You don't speak another dialect. You don't carry coins. You don't know the customs. You're not even sure how old you are. So you stay. There's safety in what you know. Even if it's hard. Even if it's dull. Even if the roof leaks and the well runs low and the same stew has been bubbling for 3 days. There's comfort in routine. In knowing where the firewood is. In knowing who to ask when your fence falls down. In knowing which patch of sky tells you when to bring the sheep in. You wake with the light. You sleep when it fades. You work in between. It's not much, but it's life. And somehow, in that quiet rhythm, there's a kind of peace. One that doesn't ask questions. One that doesn't need to know anything beyond what's visible from the top of the nearest hill. Now and then, you hear of a war. A king dying. A comet that frightened a village 5 days' walk away. But news rarely reaches you directly. Stories pass through too many mouths to matter. They lose urgency somewhere between the merchant and the shepherd's cousin. Even time feels different here. Seasons don't shift sharply. They bleed into one another. A damp spring becomes a soggy summer. A hard frost turns into the kind of winter that chews through your boots. You don't count years. You count harvests. Dry ones. Wet ones. The bad one, when the rye turned black with rot. The good one, when the barley came in thick. And even old Marjorie smiled for a whole week. The steward comes sometimes. He collects grain, asks questions, writes things down. You answer carefully. Not too much detail. He doesn't like detail. You've never met the king. You're not sure what he does, but you know his name. And you say it when you pray, just in case it matters. Because out here, on the edge of the map, things don't change. And when they do, it's usually for the worse. Still, the hearth glows. The roof mostly holds. The cottage is warm. And tomorrow, the same sun will rise over the same hills. And for now, that's enough. In your lifetime, you'll walk hundreds of miles. But most of them will be in circles. For most people in the medieval countryside, the world rarely extended beyond a few miles from the place they were born. It wasn't for lack of curiosity, or strength, or even footwear, though boots were often a luxury. It was because the world beyond the next hill didn't feel like it belonged to you. And the thought of seeking it out, that felt as unreachable as flight. From the moment you could walk, you learned every inch of the land between your door and the far edge of the field. You knew the exact shape of every tree stump along the path to the well. You could tell who had passed along the road, just by the depth of their footprints in the mud. Everything beyond that became abstract. The next village might be 5 miles away, but it may as well have been across an ocean. You'd heard the stories, who married whom, who stole a goat, who claimed that priests snored through mass. But seeing it for yourself, unlikely. Travel wasn't just rare, it was dangerous. Not in the thrilling, adventurous way. In the quiet, exhausting, possibly fatal sort of way. Roads weren't roads, as we think of them. They were muddy trails, snaking through forests, fields, and empty silent land. No signs. No inns. No maps. Just vague advice like go until you see the leaning pine, then turn left at the stone shaped like a sleeping pig. And those paths, they held their own kind of peril. First, the forest. Medieval forests weren't tranquil havens. They were dense and dark, tangled with roots, and alive with unidentifiable sounds. Boars, wolves, and people who preferred not to be found. If you weren't born to the woods didn't welcome you. Then there were the bandits, men with nothing to lose, no fields to till, no names to speak of. Travelers made easy targets, especially if they looked even vaguely well-fed. A man walking with purpose might be assumed to carry coin. A woman walking alone might be assumed to carry something worth stealing. And confidence, that wasn't armor. Everyone bled the same. Worst of all, perhaps, was simply getting lost. This wasn't a matter of inconvenience. There was no one coming to find you. No signs to follow. No river to guide you home. You could walk for days and see no soul. Your body could vanish into the underbrush like smoke, and no one would know you were missing until the next feast day, when someone asked about you, and someone else just shrugged. Even if you were brave enough to set out, there were practical matters to consider. Who would tend your fields? Who would feed your animals? What if the Lord's steward arrived while you were gone, ledger in hand? Absence wasn't something you could explain to a man collecting tax. And if you did somehow reach another village, then what? You weren't expected. You weren't welcomed. Outsiders meant trouble, sickness, thievery, heresy. You spoke a little differently, used odd phrases, maybe held your spoon the wrong way. Suspicion followed you like a shadow. Hospitality wasn't guaranteed. Food was scarce. Beds were taken. No one owed you anything. So you stayed. Not because home was safe, because it wasn't, but because it was known. You knew which part of the roof leaked when it rained, which chickens wandered too far, which neighbor might lend a tool without asking too many questions. Beyond your village, the world owed you nothing. Still, from time to time, travelers came through. Not peasants like you, but merchants, monks, messengers, people who had purpose or protection or both. They passed once or twice a year, dragging carts of wool or barrels of salted fish, trailing stories like smoke behind them. Tales of cities made of stone, shops filled with spices, streets that didn't turn to soup in the rain. It sounded impossible. You listened, but you didn't dare dream. Even if such places were real, what would you do there? You couldn't read. You had no coins. You wouldn't know their customs. The city would swallow you whole and forget your name. So you stayed. Not out of fear, though fear was part of it, but because you had things to tend, a fence to mend, a niece to mind, barley to dry, and a dozen other tasks waiting before the sun dipped behind the tree line. Truthfully, the world didn't need to be any bigger than it was. Your village had gossip, conflict, weather, sickness, fleeting joys. It had the rhythm of bells, and the changing of seasons, and the quiet pride of surviving another day. Sometimes, when the sky stretched a little too wide, or the wind changed just so, you dreamed of what lay beyond the woods. But most days, you just hoped the stew wouldn't burn while you fetched water. Some people did leave. Usually the desperate, sometimes the reckless, occasionally the ambitious. A young man might chase work or glory, or a cause worth dying for. He might return with a limp, or a story, or not at all. And when he didn't come back, no one asked too many questions. They just said, he went beyond the trees. And that was enough. For those who stayed, life was small, but it was known. You weren't lonely. Not exactly. You shared your days with family, neighbors, animals, and the land itself. There was comfort in repetition. Comfort in familiar aches and familiar chores. You didn't need to taste cinnamon to know the joy of sweet bread, or see a distant skyline to feel wonder. Love, sorrow, boredom, and hope, all of it could exist in one patch of earth. And as the years passed, and the aches burrowed deeper into your bones, and the children grew taller than the fence posts, the idea of leaving faded, not with sadness, but with understanding. Some people are meant to move. You were meant to stay. There is no blueprint for your home, no architect, no tidy stack of lumber waiting to be assembled. There is only mud and wood, and whatever the land hasn't already claimed. Your home isn't a house in the way most people think of one. It's a compromise, a negotiation between shelter and weather, between labor and decay, between what you need and what the earth reluctantly agrees to give. You begin with the frame, rough-hewn timbers from the nearest trees, cut with tools passed through more hands than you can remember. The wood isn't straight, it bends, it warps. But that's fine. So do your walls. Once the frame is up, you weave thin branches or pliable sticks between the posts, a process called wattle. It's not elegant. It's not even particularly fast, but it holds together, like the rest of your life. Then comes the daub, a thick mix of mud, straw, water and manure. You slap it on by hand, You press the mixture into the cracks, molding it between the gaps with fingers half numb from cold. You smooth it just enough to hold back the wind, pretending each stroke is purposeful. It dries slowly, flaking in the sun, occasionally crumbling in clumps that have to be replaced before winter settles in. The smell, pungent and earthy, becomes something you simply live with. Over time, you stop noticing it at all. The roof is made of thatch, layers of dried straw, tightly packed and lashed to the beams overhead. When first laid, it's golden, almost pretty in the right light. But time is cruel. Then come the rains, then the birds, then the years. The gold dulls to grey, the edges unravel, and tiny holes begin to appear in places you swore were fine yesterday. Buckets become permanent fixtures in corners of the room you once hoped to keep dry. You don't replace the roof, you patch it, again and again, until the patches themselves begin to outnumber the original roof. And sometimes, in a moment of tired frustration, you wonder if it would be simpler to sleep under a cart. The floor beneath your feet is dirt. You tell yourself it's firm, packed down through years of walking, sweeping and stomping. It is in its own way. But when the rains come, it softens into mud again. When the cold returns, it cracks. And when the goats are brought inside at night, you never quite know what you're stepping in. You might spread rushes or straw over it for comfort. That helps for a while. But the straw soaks, soils, and crumbles into dust beneath your heels. Eventually the straw and dirt blur into one and you accept the mess as part of the landscape. Windows exist in theory, holes in the wall, covered by wooden shutters that never quite close properly. Glass is too precious, too fragile, too far removed from your world. So the wind comes in, the cold slips through, sounds from the barnyard drift indoors, and sometimes, so do the animals. There's a single door, usually hanging askew since the frame shifted in the last frost. It closes with a wooden peg, or a hook. Not for protection, there's nothing worth stealing, but to keep the chickens in and the wind out. Inside, the space is best described as shared. One room, perhaps two, if someone managed to cobble together a lean-to or a loft, but usually just one. This is where you sleep, eat, cook, mend, talk, argue and dream. Parents, children, a cousin or two, a grandparent, maybe even a neighbor's child whose parents are sick, gone, or both, all under one slanting roof. At the center sits the hearth, built from stone if fortune smiled on you, clay if it didn't. Smoke rises through a hole in the roof, more or less. There's no chimney, so the air inside is always thick, smoky, a little damp, and tinged with the scent of stew that's been reheated one too many times. The furniture is spare, a table, a bench, maybe a stool, a chest, if someone in the family was handy with tools or lucky enough to marry into one. Beds are wooden frames stuffed with straw or feathers. They're shared, of course, and they creak and squeak with every movement. Blankets are wool, heavy, scratchy, and rarely fully dry. Above, the rafters double as storage. Bundles of garlic, strings of onions, clusters of dried herbs, maybe a ham if the pig was generous that year. You can smell the changing of seasons just by the air above your head. Sometimes, it comforts. Sometimes, it reminds you how close you are to hunger. The animals are part of the household, not just by necessity, but by default. The cow sleeps in the corner. So do the chickens. A goat or two. Maybe. It's not clean, but it's warm. You get used to the noises, the clucking, the rustling, the occasional startled bleat in the dark. They become part of the nighttime symphony, along with the sigh of wind through the thatch and the slow, sleepy creak of the shifting walls. Nothing is quite level. The floor dips. The walls lean. The roof sags like it's breathing with the weather. You fix what you can. You ignore the rest. Every spring you promise yourself you'll fix the back wall. Every autumn, it still leans. This isn't a house built for permanence. It's a house built to survive the next storm. Yet for all its flaws, and there are many, it is still home. You know where the draft sneaks in, and how to stop it with an old sack. You know which bean can hold the pot, and which one groans if someone leans too close. You know how the afternoon sun slants through the gaps in the wall, and where the dog curls up each night. To strangers, it's a picture of poverty, but to you, it's effort, it's resilience, it's survival. A roof that hasn't collapsed is something to be proud of. A fire that's still burning at dawn is a quiet blessing. A dry corner is a treasure. And when you lie down at the end of the day, wrapped in the warmth of smoke, straw, and shared breath, you feel a strange kind of peace, not pride, exactly, but presence. This space, flawed and frail as it is, holds you, and in turn you hold it. For a medieval peasant, food wasn't pleasure. It wasn't variety or color, or celebration. It was a daily puzzle, solved over and over again with the same meager pieces and the same weary hope that this time it might actually fill you. The kitchen, if it could be called that, was simply a corner near the hearth. No pantry, no shelves of dry goods, no sunny windows lined with herbs, just a pot, a fire, and a short ever-changing list of what hadn't spoiled. At the center of nearly every meal was pottage, a kind of eternal stew, always bubbling, never quite finished. It wasn't made so much as maintained. You added to it during the day, skimmed it at night, kept it warm through seasons, hoping nothing strange grew in it while your back was turned. The ingredients depended entirely on what you had, which usually wasn't much. On good days, the pot might hold cabbage, leeks, barley, or beans. If you had garlic or onions, you counted yourself lucky. In winter, dried peas or lentils stood in. And if fortune truly smiled, a scrap of salted pork found its way in, more likely a bone, prized less for its meat, and more for the memory of it. A single bone could be boiled for days, coaxing out every last trace of flavor. The taste, consistent, earthy, gray, more about warmth than delight. You didn't eat pottage because it was good, you ate it because it was there. A hot meal wasn't luxury, it was triumph. The pot itself was rarely cleaned, it was wiped, scraped, reused. Each batch carried whispers of the last. There were no spices to disguise it, no vinegar to lift it, just a steady, quiet dullness, like boiled history. Bread played the other starring role, not soft, not golden, and certainly not inviting. Bread in the medieval world was a far cry from anything you'd find in a modern bakery. Dense, dark, and tough. It was usually made from rye, barley, or oats, grains more affordable and easier to grow than the coveted wheat. Soft white bread was a delicacy, reserved for the upper classes. For peasants, even glimpsing it was rare, let alone affording to bake with it. The loaves they did have were small, heavy, and stubbornly refused to rise. They crumbled easily, and could go rock hard in a day, perfect for knocking out a rat, or possibly a neighbor. Still, it filled the stomach, and gave you something to soak up your stew. On the worst days, bread was cobbled together from whatever was left at the bottom of the miller's barrel, questionable flours, ground peas, husks, and chaff. In truly desperate times, people added bark, not as a metaphor, but literally. They scraped and ground the inner layer of tree bark into the dough. The result was famine bread, bitter, dense, barely digestible, but just enough to keep you technically alive. When even flour became scarce, peasants relied on trenchers, thick slices of stale bread used as plates. These soaked up stew and grease, and were either eaten at the end of the meal, tossed to the animals, or handed down the table to someone of even lower status. A bread-based pecking order. Protein was a rare guest at the peasant table. Chickens were more valuable alive for their eggs, and cows for their milk. Eating livestock was a last resort, and if it happened, not a scrap went to waste. The meat, fat, organs, and bones were all used. Blood was cooked into puddings. Fat was rendered. The head might become soup. Every part found its place. Pork was the most common meat when it was available. Pigs were efficient animals, and their salted fat added flavor to many otherwise joyless dishes. But slaughtering a pig wasn't casual. It required planning, preservation, and storage. It meant weeks of salting, boiling, and hanging to ensure nothing spoiled. Fishing could supplement the diet if you lived near water and if you had permission. Lords often controlled local lakes and rivers, and fishing without their blessing could earn you punishment. When you did fish, it was often for eels, river fish, or whatever wouldn't spoil quickly. Salted herring, if acquired, was a treasure. The church also played its part in shaping the menu. On Fridays and during Lent, meat was forbidden. People adapted, often creatively. Beaver tails, for instance, were reclassified as fish by theological loophole, just enough to keep up appearances and stave off hunger. Milk was both common and volatile. Without refrigeration, it had to be consumed quickly or turned into cheese or butter. Butter was a luxury in poorer homes, used with caution. Cheese was a staple, hard, tangy, dry. A good round of cheese stored for the winter meant the cow had been generous that year. Even when spoiled, milk products were rarely wasted. Sour milk was used anyway. Rancid butter and moldy cheese were simply trimmed around. You hoped your stomach could handle what your eyes avoided. Drinks were limited and often driven by necessity. Water was risky, often contaminated, especially in warmer months or near careless neighbors upstream. So ale became the default. Weak ale, or small beer, was brewed at home and consumed by everyone, including children. It had just enough alcohol to kill bacteria and take the edge off thirst. If apples or pears were around, cider could be made. Wine was for nobles and clergy. Mead was rare. Milk was mostly reserved for the young or the ill. So from breakfast to bedtime, it was ale, ale, and more ale. Not because it was festive, but because it was safe. Vegetables formed the true foundation of the peasant diet. Cabbage, onions, garlic, turnips, and leeks. Carrots, though not orange yet, but white or purple. These were grown in small precious garden plots and used from root to leaf. Turnip tops became greens. Skins became compost or fire fodder. Nothing went to waste. Fruit was fleeting. Apples were the most common, followed by berries and wild plums. Fresh fruit had to be eaten quickly or dried for winter. Preserving was difficult. Sugar was beyond reach. Honey, if you kept bees, was precious and used sparingly. So most meals stayed savory, if you could call it that. Herbs were grown when possible. Parsley, sage, dill, mint. They weren't there for flavor so much as medicine or folklore. Some were thought to ward off illness. Others kept pests at bay. If they happened to improve the taste, that was a welcome side effect, but rarely the point. Meals were communal. You sat on benches around a fire. No courses, no recipes. Just a pot, a crust of bread, and the hope that something might be left for tomorrow. Complaining did nothing. It didn't thicken the stew. On feast days, weddings, harvests, saints' days, you might roast a bird or make a pie, but not the flaky kind. Medieval pies were sealed boxes of hard dough, meant more to preserve than delight. Smeat-filled, and if you were lucky, heavily spiced. Pepper, ginger, and cinnamon, when available, hinted that someone had traded well. But most days weren't feast days. Most days, you scraped your bowl, soaked your bread, drank your ale, and leaned back, not satisfied, but full enough to last the night. There was comfort in repetition, in the rhythm of routine. You knew what the pot would taste like. You knew how much bread was left. So you watched the same hands prepare the same meal, by the same fire. Outside, the wind whispered through the cracks in your wall. The animals stirred in their sleep. The stew boiled, the bread cooled, and somehow, once again, you had enough. Yet even in your own home, you owned very little. Maybe a small patch of land, a few tools, some livestock, a crooked house you built with your own hands, but none of it truly belonged to you. It all belonged to the Lord, not a king or distant monarch, but your local landholder, the man in the house up the hill. His house was slightly less crooked, his meals slightly better, and his roof probably didn't leak. He owned the land, and by extension everything on it, including, in a way, you. You were a villain. A term, not an insult. It meant you worked the land, but didn't own it. You were bound to it. You couldn't leave without permission. You couldn't pass it down freely. You owed labor, goods, and deference. Not a slave, but not free either. You didn't speak with the Lord himself. You dealt with the steward, the one who managed the lands, more crucially, tracked what everyone owed. And you owed plenty. There was the labor, a few days a week, more during harvest. You were expected to work the Lord's fields for free. This was corvée labor. No pay, no thanks, just the knowledge that somewhere in the manor house, someone dined because you toiled. Taxes came in many forms. A portion of your grain, a share of your wool, a chicken here, some eggs there. If you brewed ale, you owed ale. If you raised a pig, you owed bacon. If you fished, well, the Lord owned the river too, and it didn't end there. The mill, used to grind your grain, came with a fee. It was the only option, illegal to grind by hand, and punishable by fine or worse. The communal oven, also taxed. Try baking at home and risk the steward's wrath. Even life milestones came at a cost. Marrying, pay a fee. Inheriting your father's land, pay a fee. Moving to another village, ask permission. And yes, pay a fee. Your livestock, your tools, even your right to marry or breed, all monitored, sometimes taxed. And what did you get in return? In theory, protection. If bandits came or a rival noble invaded, the Lord had armed men. In famine, he might release grain from his storehouses, though rarely without charge. If a goat trampled your garden, the Lord's court might settle it, for a price. This was feudalism, a web of obligations framed in the language of loyalty and protection. But in truth, it was a system of ownership. The land was everything. Those who owned it ruled, those who didn't obeyed. The manor stood apart, often on higher ground, built of stone or timber, with thick thatched roofs. It boasted tapestries, tables, servants, and the Lord himself, wrapped in wool and fur, eating meals you couldn't imagine. He likely didn't know your name, but he knew your numbers, how much barley you owed, how many eggs you'd promised, whether your son was old enough for labor duty. Everything was recorded, not by you, you couldn't read, but by the steward, the reeve, the bailiff, men with tablets and parchments, men with questions you learned to answer carefully. Fail to meet your obligations, there were consequences, fines, goods seized, extra labor days. In the worst cases, your land could be reclaimed, your tools taken, your home, your goats, gone, your dignity too. You didn't resist. Resistance wasn't rebellion, it was foolishness. And yet, the strange part, it worked. Not because it was fair, but because it was stable, predictable. You knew what was expected. There were no surprises, just the steady grinding rhythm of give, give, give. And now and then, just now and then, the Lord gave something back. A feast day might bring food to the hungry. A holiday could mean a rare break from labor. A kind word, perhaps, spoken from a horse's back. Not enough to right the scales of power. Not nearly, but just enough to keep them from tipping. The bond between peasant and lord was never one of friendship, but it endured. Your lord might be young or old, gentle or cruel, ever present or rarely seen, but always unquestionably above you. That was simply the order of things. You didn't question it. You bowed when he passed. You removed your cap. You used the right words, not because he earned your respect, but because you didn't want trouble. And perhaps, deep down, a part of you still clung to a faint hope that one day maybe he might notice you, reward you, lift you, even just a little. It almost never happened, but that fragile hope kept the system alive, not just through fear, but through the tiniest spark of possibility, that if you worked hard enough, obeyed long enough, prayed loud enough, something might change. Meanwhile, life trudged on. The steward kept walking, the reeve kept writing, The mill kept grinding, and you, year after year, season after season, kept digging your hands into the soil. There was no retirement, no bonus, no path upward, only the quiet understanding that you had done your duty. You had survived another year under the weight of someone else's name, and as long as the Lord was satisfied, you were allowed to go on living. Long before the Black Death swept across Europe and carved its name into history, peasants already knew sickness intimately, not just the seasonal colds and coughs, though there were plenty of those, but the slow, lurking presence of something always waiting to go wrong: infection, fever, wasting, swelling, choking coughs. Disease wasn't an interruption in life, it was part of life. You didn't need a continental catastrophe to be laid low. Sometimes all it took was a scratch, a flea, a sip of water that looked clear but wasn't. Unlike the weather or taxes, illness didn't follow rules. It came without warning. It rarely left quietly. There were no hospitals, not really. If your village was lucky, there might be a wise woman, a midwife, maybe someone who knew which herbs to boil and which to burn. If you were extremely lucky, there might be a monk nearby, literate, well-meaning, and perhaps slightly more helpful than a desperate prayer. But most of the time, if you got sick, you stayed home, you lay down, you sweated through your clothes and hoped. People didn't understand disease. The word germ didn't exist. Microscopes wouldn't be invented for centuries. What you had instead were theories, old ones, confusing ones, and more often than not, wrong ones. Many believed in miasma, bad air that carried disease through smell. If your village reeked of rot, manure, and smoke, it was thought to be dangerous. And in a way it was, but not for the reasons they imagined. To fend off the bad air, people stuffed herbs into their clothes, carried flowers in their sleeves, and pressed vinegar-soaked rags to their faces. These weren't pleasant, they weren't helpful, but they were deeply believed. Others saw sickness as punishment from God, divine retribution for impure thoughts, disobedient acts, or some general failure of morality. If your child fell ill, it was a test. If your crops failed, and your body followed, it was your sin, or perhaps your neighbor's. Local customs filled in the rest. Some believed in the evil eye, a curse delivered by a jealous glare. Others blamed moon phases, animal spirits, or saints with foul tempers. One widespread belief was that illness entered through the soles of the feet. The solution: boil them. And if that failed, you might try burning something, your bedding perhaps. The cures were often as strange as the causes. If you had a fever, someone might come to bleed you, a local man with a blade, a bowl, and more confidence than skill. Sometimes leeches were used, sometimes sharp stones. The goal was to balance the humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. If they were out of balance, so were you. No one had ever seen a humor, but they were blamed for nearly every ailment. For swelling, you might apply poultices, mashed herbs, mud, even bread wrapped in cloth. Some remedies worked, most didn't. A few made things worse. But doing something, anything, brought comfort. If your stomach ached, you might chew on charcoal. If you coughed blood, you might drink wine mixed with crushed pearls. If your vision blurred, someone might blow smoke over your head while whispering a prayer. And if your leg turned black, that was likely the end. Plague amulets were popular too. Bits of metal or bone worn around the neck, sometimes inscribed with sacred words, sometimes blessed by a priest. People buried onions in the corners of their homes. They hung garlic above the door. One remedy involved tying a live chicken to the infected area, hoping the sickness would pass into the bird. It rarely did, but when hope was all you had, you clung to whatever might hold it. Sickness was isolating, but not in the way we think today. There were no quarantines, no emergency visits. You worked until you couldn't. And when that moment came, you lay down. Life around you carried on. Children were fed, animals were fed. You might be given broth, perhaps a quiet prayer. Sometimes the illness passed, the fever broke, the swelling eased, you walked again. Slower now, with a limp and a deeper appreciation for hot soup. Other times it didn't pass, and your family lit a candle. Plague in the broader sense wasn't always the grand horror of stacked bodies and deserted towns. More often it was a slow sickness, skin turning dark, limbs swelling, a cough that echoed off stone walls. Smallpox, leprosy, dysentery, even influenza could sweep through a village and leave half its people bedridden. There were no numbers to track, no charts, just stories. A traveler said it started in the next village. Someone heard 3 children had died near the river. You paid attention. You boiled more water. You burned more herbs. You stayed away, though no one quite said why. Death wasn't always feared, but it was understood. People knew when it was near. Breathing slowed, skin cooled, eyes dulled. There were prayers for the dying, whispered in the flicker of firelight. So when the Black Death arrived in the 14th century, it didn't bring a new idea, it brought a new scale. The idea that you could be well in the morning and dead by night was already familiar. Now it just happened everywhere, all at once. The plague struck in waves, each one stronger, stranger. Bubbles swelled in the groin and neck, fever scrambled the mind. Blood turned black and bubbled. People died in days, sometimes hours. Entire villages vanished. Bells rang too often. The fields went untended. Some peasants fled, but disease traveled faster than feet. Others turned to religion, doubling their prayers, whipping their backs, promising to live better lives, if only they were spared. A few turned to violence, blaming outsiders, sinners, anyone but the wind. The church offered answers, comfort, and burial. Monks died in droves. Priests disappeared. In many places, funerals ceased altogether. Bodies were buried in pits, no names, no markers. And still life went on. People adapted. They learned to live alongside sickness. Not with joy, but with a quiet, worn resilience. Homes were cleaned more often. Herbs were shared. New prayers were whispered. Some believed surviving one illness protected them from the next. Others didn't believe anything, but still rose each morning to milk the cow. Children grew up knowing which plants to chew, which to boil, and which to avoid altogether. They learned how to wrap wounds, how to outwait a fever, how to recognize when someone wouldn't recover, and when it was time to stop hoping. And through it all, they didn't stop living. They married. They harvested. They shared what meals they could manage. Bowls of broth passed from hand to hand, stories murmured by the fire. They spoke of old sicknesses and the stubborn ones who'd outlasted them. Someone's grandfather once survived a winter fever with nothing but garlic water and sheer defiance. Plague was not the end of the world. It was merely part of it, a cruel visitor, but one the people had learned to endure, and endurance itself became a kind of defiance, a quiet resistance, a vow whispered in silence that life would continue, even if only in memory. If tomorrow never came, then perhaps someone would remember your name, or at least the way you always added rosemary to the broth. Nightfall in the medieval countryside didn't bring peace. It brought silence, the kind that wrapped around you like the dark inside a cave. A silence made of distant creaks, occasional rustles, and your own breath roaring in your ears. The day ended when the light died, and anything not already finished had to wait. Darkness didn't just fall, it pressed in. The world shrank to the space you could touch. There was no artificial light to push it back. No burning candles, wax was precious. If you owned a tallow lamp, it was saved for emergencies or sacred moments. So the fire dimmed. The coals pulsed softly. And that was the end of the day. Sleep came next, but not the kind we know. It wasn't one long stretch. Medieval sleep unfolded in 2 acts. First sleep, a waking interval, then second sleep. This rhythm wasn't a flaw, it was an adaptation to the long empty hours between dusk and dawn. You drift into the first sleep shortly after nightfall. The fire banked low, animals hushed, children tucked close. The home stretched into quiet. 1 room, maybe 2. If you were fortunate, you had a mattress of straw or feathers, lumpy and worn. If not, you lay on woven rushes, or the bare earth, softened only by habit. Everyone slept in the same space, family, servants, even animals. Not from closeness, but from necessity. It was the only warm room in the house. On the coldest nights, warmth took priority over propriety. A goat might sleep near the door. A dog curled by the hearth. Chickens clucked softly from a basket in the corner. There was no privacy. To sleep alone wasn't comfort, it was punishment. Solitude belonged to the rich. The rest simply made do. You turned to the wall. You stuffed straw in your ears. You shared breath, shared blankets, shared dreams. Someone always snored. You got used to it. First sleep lasted a few hours, then like the turning of a key, people would wake. It wasn't odd. It was expected. Around midnight, the world sat still. In this pocket of time, some stirred the coals. Others whispered. Some prayed. A few slipped outside to relieve themselves beneath the stars. It was also a time for dreaming. Vivid dreams. Sacred dreams. People believed the midnight hour opened a veil between worlds, the living and the dead, the holy and the mundane. If you dreamed during this waking interval, you remembered it. You shared it in the morning. Not in passing, but with reverence. Second sleep followed. Deeper, slower. This was the sleep that healed, or tried to. When the ache of the day dulled, when the blisters cooled. If it was uninterrupted, you were lucky. If it wasn't, you waited. Lay still, waited for dawn to offer permission to rise. The home never went fully silent. A fire crackled. Wind whispered. Through the thatch, a baby fussed. A cow shifted. Sometimes there was coughing, the kind that never stopped. Wet, rattling, hollow. Everyone heard it. No one spoke of it. It was understood. Fear of the night was never irrational. Dangers walked in darkness. Some real, some imagined. Wolves, for instance, weren't fantasy. They were real, and hungry. In some places, their howls drifted close enough to raise the hairs on your neck. There were also thieves, wandering rogues, strangers. Fires sparked from careless coals. Roofs groaned under snow. And then, the things no one explained. Ghosts, witches, demons, spirits. You didn't talk about them, but you knew they were out there. To ward them off, people followed rituals. Iron by the door, a cross above the hearth, herbs hung near windows, rosemary, sage, rue. You might whisper blessings into the straw mattress, tie a string around your child's wrist, just in case. Sleep left you vulnerable. That was a belief as real as cold. Some thought the soul wandered, while the body rested. So beds faced the fire. Mirrors were covered. Feet never pointed toward the door. It mattered. Cold was its own enemy. It slipped through walls, through cracks, through your very bones. There weren't piles of blankets. You layered. Wool, fur, cloaks, tunics. No one undressed. The idea of removing your clothes before sleep was absurd. You slept in them, sometimes even in boots. Closeness brought warmth and discomfort. Someone shifted. Someone muttered. There were knees and elbows, and the occasional wet nose from the family dog, but it was life. It wasn't peaceful. It was shared, and in that sharing came a strange comfort. You heard your father breathe, your child twitch, your grandmother murmur a prayer in her sleep. Dreams mattered. They were signs. A field of wheat might mean prosperity. A snake could mean sickness. A broken tooth, death. You learned to read them, or you asked someone who could. Every village had dream readers, not officially, but known just the same. The church warned against dreams. Some, it said, came from the devil. Sleep was a moment of temptation. You were told to pray before lying down, to keep your soul ready in case the night claimed you, because it could. People went to bed and didn't rise again. Illness crept in while you rested. A fever bloomed, a cough deepened, and come morning, someone might be gone, quietly, like they'd been stolen. This made waking a small sacred thing. When the first light returned, when the rooster cried out, when coals stirred back to life, it meant you'd survived. You rose slowly. Joints ached. The cold bit. You wiped your face. You counted the living. Each stirring body a quiet blessing. If someone didn't move, they were checked. Then the day began. Water was fetched. Bread prepared. Animals fed. Dreams, if they mattered, were told. The night faded, not forgotten, just softened, folded into memory. In winter, sleep came early, stayed late. In summer, it shrank. But the rhythm stayed. First sleep, wake. Second sleep. A world without clocks, but not without order. For all its discomfort, there was something honest in that rhythm, something grounding. You didn't chase comfort, you chased survival. And if along the way you found a moment of rest, a night free of fear, a dream that brought peace instead of warning, that was a gift. You didn't question it. You didn't expect it to last. Some years you were simply hungry. Other years you were in famine. There's a difference. Hunger could be managed. It had rules. You stretched the food. You rationed. You hoped. Famine broke the rules. It arrived when the fields failed, when the root cellar went bare, when hope itself began to spoil. In a medieval village, you saw it coming. It began in spring. Too much rain, or not enough. Barley came up patchy. Beans bloomed, then withered. Cabbages split too early. The wheat bowed, stunted, as if mourning something already lost. People noticed. Everyone noticed. No one said it at first, but eyes met. Quiet calculations unfolded behind weary faces. How much grain is left? How much seed can we spare? How much can we eat? The answers were never comforting, but the hardest choices came not in winter, but in summer, because that was when you had to decide. Do you plant the seeds, or grind them into flour? Do you gamble on a harvest, or feed your child one more warm bowl today? So the portions shrank. Stews thinned. Bread grew smaller. Bowls didn't return empty, just less often. You didn't panic. Not yet. You told yourself this had happened before, that another village might help, that the Lord's granaries might still hold. Hope stayed, just not much else. By August, denial became harder. By September, impossible. You stopped feeding the animals first. Chickens fell silent. The goats' bleats echoed hollow through the dark. The dog, if you still had one, no longer barked. It just followed you now, closer than ever, as if it knew it might be next. Bread became something sacred. A single loaf, split 5 ways, chewed slowly and silently. No one complained about the crust. Even the smallest crumb was gathered up like treasure. The stew was thin, mostly water now, and if it had any color at all, it came from the pot itself. You boiled weeds, ground up roots, pulled up strange plants, praying they weren't poisonous. Some weren't. You learned by trial. You didn't sleep through the night anymore. Not from fear, but from hunger gnawing at your belly every few hours. The children stopped asking questions. That's when it felt real. They didn't ask when the bread was coming. They didn't beg for honey or stories. They sat still by the fire, eyes glazed, learning to wait without complaint. The village, once full of voices, had fallen quiet. No more laughter in the lanes. No more arguments over sheep. Just the rare sound of a cough, or the sharp crack of firewood splitting. Famine didn't make people cruel. It made them quiet. Sometimes, someone would bring back a rabbit, or a bird, or a handful of bitter acorns that needed soaking and grinding. You chewed them anyway. You smiled, not because they tasted good, but because it meant you had something. You tried not to resent the manna. Sometimes they gave grain, sometimes nothing. The steward came less often, which was both a blessing and a curse. He wasn't there to take, but he also wasn't there to help. His absence said more than his presence ever had. The church did what it could. Bread after mass, alms for the poorest. But they were stretched thin too. You prayed more, not because of faith, but because the words were easy when your hands were too tired for anything else. Some left the village entirely, looking for work, for food, for God. A few returned. Most didn't. You never asked what became of them. You were too tired. Your body began to change. You could feel your ribs from the inside out, like they were pressing too close to the skin. You stood slower. You bruised easier. You'd wake with your fists clenched, like your hands were still holding tools you couldn't afford to use. And the cold, God, the cold, hurt more. The fire became your closest friend. You spent more time tending it than cooking over it. You slept facing it. You fed it even as your belly went empty. Heat was the one comfort left that you could still offer. By then, everything that could be eaten had been eaten. Roots, weeds, the last handfuls of stale flour. Bones were boiled 3 times over. Bark was soaked. You baked famine bread so dense it cracked your tooth. And when the food was truly gone, you looked at things that were never meant to be food and tried to believe they might be. Leather, boiled, and salted. Not satisfying. Not nourishing. But technically chewable. You found a rat once. You didn't scream. You thanked God. Then you cooked it in secret and told no one. You still carry the guilt, but not regret. The dreams turned strange. You dreamed of long tables, full of roast meats, fresh bread, dark wine. You woke chewing your tongue. You dreamed of boiling pots, even though you hadn't boiled anything in 3 days. You dreamed of green shoots pushing through snow, of animals returning, of childhood when hunger had been simpler. Some nights you dreamed of being full. Those were the worst. You always woke crying. The graveyard expanded, slowly at first, then rapidly. Too fast to keep up. You knew someone had died when the church bell didn't ring. It meant there weren't enough hands left to pull the rope. Graves were shallow. Prays were brief. Mourning became wordless. Everyone was too busy managing their own hunger. You wanted to grieve, but grief required strength you couldn't spare. So you swallowed that too. Then, as always, the famine ended. Not in a moment, but gradually. Rain returned and stayed. The earth softened. Seeds sprouted. Plants reached up, thin, but alive. You had enough energy to feel hope again. The first harvest was saved for others. Children first, then the elders. You took the smallest bowl. You smiled as you passed it on. And when that first real loaf came from the oven, cracked on top and dark on the bottom, you just stared at it for a while, remembering every empty day, every trick, every lie told to shield someone else. You ate slowly. This time it filled you. But by then the church had already marked you. It claimed you at baptism, spoke Latin over your breath, and stitched your soul into something far bigger than your village. You didn't belong to the church by choice. There was no choice. In the cold hours before dawn, before the fire caught, in the damp nights when the wind crept through your shutters, you could feel it, like gravity. It wasn't beside your life. It was your life. It organized you, judged you, taxed you, forgave you, defined what came after. The church wasn't a place you visited. It was the air you breathed, the road you walked, the rhythm of your year. It was the voice that whispered over your grave, and the one that whispered about it long before you got there. The priest, often the only one who could read, wasn't just a confessor. He was your calendar, your counselor, your only oracle. He knew the mysteries of the stars and the stories of saints. He could say why your cow died, or why the sky turned black. He walked the village like a man carrying both blessing and threat in the folds of his robes. You brought him your sins in hushed voices, hoping not to see disappointment in his eyes. You tried not to think about what he already knew. You saw him at your birth, at your wedding, and he would be there at your death. Those were the only 3 ceremonies a peasant could count on. And in between, he spoke for a God you feared more than you loved, because love, you were told, meant obedience. Latin was the language of mass, and it might as well have been magic. You stood beside your family, feet numb from the cold, listening to words that didn't belong to you. You didn't understand them, but you believed, or tried to. You believed that something had changed, that the bread was no longer bread, that the wine was something else entirely, that the murmured phrases and practiced gestures could shift the divine. You didn't speak the words, but they passed through you anyway. You mouthed what you could. You crossed yourself when others did. You learned the rhythm of holiness, the way someone learns the path to a well, without knowing every step, only knowing that you needed it. The church told you when to fast and when to feast. It carved the year into sacred pieces. Lent, Advent, Epiphany, All Saints. You didn't say March or April. You said after Easter, or near St. Michael. It told you what you could eat, when you could eat it, and how guilty you should feel about enjoying it. 40 days without meat before Easter, followed by a feast so rich it made you dizzy. Fish on Fridays, even if you lived nowhere near water. Almond milk for the wealthy. Turnips and cold broth for everyone else. On saints' days you shared what you could. On fast days you imagined what you couldn't. But even when your bowl was emptied, your plate was full of rules. Your calendar wasn't just for prayer. It was for payment. The church took its due 1/10 of your yield. Every season, no matter how the land fared. Grain, eggs, wool, chickens, cider. If it came from your field or your body, it had a price. You gave because it was God's portion. Or so you were told. But God didn't come to collect. The priest did. Or the steward, with his ledgers and his silent nods. You watched your best barley carted off to the tithe barn, always bigger than your home. You saw your neighbors hand over their last sack of oats while the priest prayed for mercy they had just paid for. And when the harvest failed, when the rains came too late, or the frost too early, the demand did not change. You owed what you owed. Sometimes they let you pay in candles or in labor. Sometimes they didn't. And sometimes, the debt grew so heavy it bent your back even when you stood upright. But the church didn't just take. It gave too. Though not always in ways you wanted. It gave you stories. It gave you structure. It gave you reasons. When your cow died without cause, the priest told you which saint to pray to. When your child fell ill, he told you it might be a test, or a punishment, or the devil slipping in through a crack in your belief. He offered blessings and sacraments, told you to light a candle or make a pilgrimage. Sometimes he gave you a scrap of relic, an old bone, a tooth, a ribbon soaked in some forgotten martyr's blood. You held it like treasure. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes it didn't. But even when it didn't, it was better than nothing. There were saints for everything. Saint Apollonia for toothaches. Saint Isidore for plowing. Saint Sebastian for plague. You didn't know where they were buried, or when they'd lived. You only knew their names, and what they could fix. Their stories were half memory, half magic, told in flickering firelight, by people who weren't sure where truth ended and legend began. You called on them when you had nothing else. You whispered their names as you stirred the pot or knelt in the field. You made deals with them, promised bread or fasting, or a long walk across the land if only they'd help you this once. They did, or seemed to. And that was enough to ask again. Pilgrimage was a holy journey, but also a way to leave. For a few days, you stepped beyond the same 5 miles you'd lived your entire life. You walked roads you didn't know, toward shrines you'd only heard of. You carried your prayers with you, strapped to your back or clutched in your hand. You slept under hedges, or in the corners of barns. You arrived footsore and raw. You stood before a bone or a statue, and hoped something would shift inside you. Sometimes it did. You returned not healed, but changed, or at least tired enough to believe you had been. Even death was a ritual, choreographed by the church. When you felt it coming, you sent for the priest. He arrived with oil and holy words. He touched your forehead, prayed over your body, tried to ease your soul into what came next. Your family gathered. The candles were lit. The bell might ring. If someone had the strength, you were buried in sacred ground, beside others who had walked the same path. And then came the masses. Your family lit more candles, paid for more prayers, and hoped the priest remembered your name in his chants. Because even in death, there were debts. The church taught that your soul might not go straight to heaven. It might linger in purgatory, a shadowed hallway between suffering and salvation. You could wait there for years, centuries or longer, unless someone helped, unless someone prayed, paid lit enough candles, said your name often enough to pull you through, and so your family gave what they could. The poor offered bread, the rich gave land, all to shorten a stay in a place no one had seen, but everyone feared, because fear too was part of the church's gift. The church explained the world when no one else could. It told you why the rains failed, why your child didn't wake, why illness took the young, and spared the cruel. It told you suffering had purpose, that obedience had reward. It gave you structure in the middle of chaos, and that structure, though it burdened you, gave you peace. Not comfort, always, but peace. You didn't question the church's power, not seriously, not out loud. You might grumble about the tithe or curse when the priest looked the other way, but you never stopped showing up. You didn't stop kneeling. You didn't stop crossing yourself when the bell rang, because if the church wasn't right, then the world had no shape at all. And a world with no shape was a terrifying thing, even when the priest drank too much, even when the bishop demanded too many taxes, even when the indulgence seller passed through town with a cart full of promises and a purse full of coins. You still believed, or you acted like you did, which in the end was mostly the same, because belief was less about what you thought, and more about what you did. You didn't understand the Latin, but you understood the structure, and you stayed inside it, because it was the only way forward. And when you died, you hoped the bells would ring, and the candles would burn, and your name would be said often enough to matter. You hoped the saints were still listening. You hoped your sins had been weighed and forgiven in equal measure. You hoped that the church, in all its heavy mystery and ancient gold, would carry you the rest of the way. You might think that after everything they endured, famine, plague, endless tithes and grinding taxes, the heavy boot of the Lord's authority, that the peasants would have risen up more often, that the weight of centuries would eventually press too hard, that one frost-bitten morning, something inside them would snap, that they'd gather in fields and town squares, with tools in hand and fire in their hearts, shouting that they would kneel no longer. But they didn't. Not often, not for long, and never all at once. There were uprisings. Yes, the peasants' revolt in England in 1381, the Jacquerie in France, decades earlier, small flames flickering across a darkened map of Europe, anger erupting in places where the lords had taken too much, pushed too hard, demanded one coin too many. Sometimes the spark caught, a tax collector's house burned, a steward chased out of town, a banner hoisted to the wind, but those fires flared and died quickly, smothered under gallows built in the village square. The silence that followed was often heavier than the one that came before, and the world did not change. The grain still had to be sown. To understand why the peasants didn't revolt more often, you have to stop imagining them as fearful or naive. They weren't. They were survivors, not of a single tragedy, but of continuous grinding hardship, year after year, generation after generation. They lived in a world of low ceilings, where hope was measured and rationed like the last scoop of grain. It wasn't courage they lacked, it was margin. Every day was a fight to keep the soup warm, the roof from leaking, the children clothed. You could plan a revolution, or you could dig potatoes. You couldn't do both. The truth is, the system endured not because it was fair or kind or even efficient, but because it was old. Its roots reached so deep into the past, into habit and tradition, that it didn't need to be justified. It simply was. You owed labor. You owed grain. You owed the church its tenth and the Lord his harvest. You owed a respectful nod when the reeve passed by your door. You were born into that owing. And unless fortune favored you unusually well, you died in it too. But by staying within the boundaries you could survive. Barely, but you could. Stepping outside the rules came at a cost most could never afford. The manor had soldiers. The church had excommunication. The king didn't know your name, but his laws bound you like rope all the same. Defiance didn't always mean death. Sometimes it was worse: banishment, starvation, the crushing burden left on your family's back. Everyone had heard a tale: a father dragged away, a mother whipped, a cousin who disappeared after refusing to pay. These stories weren't passed down to inspire rebellion, but to warn against it. Besides, rebellion didn't often feel like an option. The people you might rise up against weren't faceless strangers. They were your neighbors, your kin. You shared tools and fences and prayers. You might loathe the steward, but still marry his daughter. You might resent the tithe, but still bake bread for mass. The village wasn't something you could tear down without tearing yourself apart. To revolt against the manor was, in a very real sense, to revolt against the rhythm of your own life. It's easy, centuries later, to paint the peasant as a figure of eternal submission, head bowed, cap in hand. But that picture misses the quiet complexity of their world. Submission was not servitude. It was negotiation. They adapted. They bartered. They bent. They found the gaps in the rules and lived within them. A pig kept off the ledger. An extra sack of rye buried beneath the floorboards. A bribe paid in eggs, not coin. These were the rebellions they could afford. Their lives were governed not by ideals, but by weather. The question wasn't what is just, but what will get us through the winter. Justice, if it ever came, was a luxury they didn't trust. Lords came and went. Priests were replaced. Rules changed. But the wind still howled. The soil still demanded toil, and children still cried from hunger. You didn't rise against that. You endured it. The church did its part, often more powerfully than the sword. It taught that suffering was holy, that endurance was righteous, that the meek would inherit the earth, though it never said when. You were told that your pain wasn't punishment, but purification, that your obedience would be rewarded not here, but beyond. And if heaven's promise wasn't enough, there was always hell, the fire, the gnashing teeth, the endless agony, for the proud, the rebellious, the ones who dared say no. Still, the peasants were not passive. Their resistance was simply quieter. They whispered about the steward's cruelty, sang crude songs about the Lord's habits, laughed when the priest stumbled over his sermon. They told stories by firelight, of better days and better men. They endured, and in that endurance, there was defiance. They found dignity in the smallest of acts: a crust of bread shared between calloused hands, a silence held in the right moment, a field furrowed in quiet defiance of rules written far away. Their rebellion wasn't loud. It was woven into the way they survived, not by embracing the system, but by nudging it just enough to catch a breath. And sometimes, the world did shift. A cruel lord passed, and his son ruled with a gentler hand. A new bishop arrived, bringing mercy instead of debts. A storm shattered stone, and reminded even the powerful that they too could fall. But such changes never came from the fields. They came from above. The peasants' task was to wait, to endure, to pass on what little they had and teach their children when to keep their heads down and when, if ever, to lift them. Still they dreamed. Of course they did. Maybe they didn't call it revolution, but they imagined something else, something better. A day when their children would not shoulder the same weight, when no one would arrive at their door demanding names, when their backs wouldn't ache before 30, when night brought only sleep, not the dread of wolves, soldiers, or the cold. Those dreams weren't expected to come true. They simply needed them to keep breathing. What's perhaps most extraordinary isn't how rarely peasants revolted, but how often they endured. They held on to their culture, their faith, their families. Even as the world ground down on them, songs lived on that were never written. Tales passed from mouth to ear across generations. They remembered the herbs that healed and those that harmed. They taught each other how to pray, how to bring life into the world, and how to return it to the earth. They built a kind of continuity that outlasted kings and crusades, not with swords, but with persistence. And that persistence was its own quiet form of defiance. When the manor demanded more than they had, they found a way to survive. When the church taxed their very souls, they still lit candles. When the world closed in, they drew nearer to one another, and waited for spring. The land may have been owned by another, but the soil remembered their hands. Revolution, as history would later come to know it, didn't live in them. There were no manifestos or marching chants, but there was another kind of power in the way they carried on, to live through hardship without being consumed by it. That was resistance. To kneel, not from weakness, but from the knowledge that tomorrow you would rise again, that was strength. And so they endured, not with statues raised in their honor, nor with songs bearing their names, but in the steady rhythm of the plow, in the soft smoke curling from cottage roofs at dusk, in the lullabies sung beside embers fading to ash. They lived on in stories, whispered to sleepy children, who would grow up and tell them again. History often forgets them, or folds them into margins beneath tales of kings and conquests. But it was the peasants who held the tapestry of the world together. Without them, there would have been no harvests, no cathedrals, no armies beneath banners. They built the world, even as they were denied ownership of it. They may not have overthrown their lords, but they outlasted them. And perhaps, in the end, that was revolution enough.